But if we can segue back to something you wanted to talk about, indeed, I would like to hear you talk about
voluntary involuntary.
Yes, yes. Could you comment on that? Because a lot of people say voluntary, the man has to want to be there, but the research doesn't indicate that.
No,
does
it doesn't. It doesn't. Now, this is a very, there's nothing simple and there's nothing easy in this work, I don't believe. And these terms, get thrown around a lot, and I don't think people understand often what they're dealing with. That's my belief from my experience.
Yes. Yeah.
If people have been trained as psychologists or social workers or counsellors, generally we get the message that people have to want to change.
Yes. How many psychologists does it take to change a light?
That's right, exactly. And
the answer, by the way, is one, but the light globe must want to be changed.
Exactly.
Yes.
So what we're dealing with here is men, as we said before, who are excuse makers, who are often in denial and minimising and blaming systems, partners, everyone but themselves. Now, if we tie this into the male script and the man box, the three hardest words for a man to say, I need help. So if we expect to run a man's program and sit back and wait for voluntary men to come, then the voluntary men who will come are volunteering with an intention. And that intention is not to help themselves. That intention is to keep the partner hooked into thinking that he's getting support, is to maybe keep the police and courts and probation and parole off his back. It may be to fake good. It may be to come in and complain about her as the real problem and him being the victim. So what the court system, what the criminal justice system does, I believe, is it gives a male following a male script and who's in that man box an excuse to come. I didn't come here of my own will. They forced me. I'm here because the cops told me to come. I'm here because this court sent me here. At least we've got him then.
Yeah.
At least we've got him in the building. Our job then with the involuntary clients is to work on their internal motivation and to turn that involuntariness into them wanting to be here. That's the skill of facilitation, and that takes time.
Yeah.
So I would much prefer to have in my group mandated involuntary men, because an involuntary man is not in the system. And if I have a man who comes to my group, I would always say, great to have you on board, but we're going to give your name to the police as we give the other men who are here. They're known to police. You will be part, if you want to be in this program, this is our program process. And I'll be transparent up front. And I don't think I ever had a man say no who came in voluntarily. But the problem, of course, is when an involuntary man drops out of the program, we don't have any way of monitoring or supervising.
No, there's nothing more you can do at
No,
that point.
no,
Yeah.
exactly. So that's my concern, that a voluntary man coming into a group may have an unintended consequence of being higher risk for his partner, because she thinks, oh, he's come to group, he's doing something, the program will change him.
Yeah.
And he wants her to believe that, and that's very intentional for some.
Yeah, I'll stay with him since he's in counselling.
Indeed, indeed.
Which is a risk factor, is it not?
Yes, it is, of a man's group. And I've actually just yesterday found out that I've received a small grant to do a project called Unintended Consequences of Men's Programs. And I'll be, myself and a team of people who I work with will be looking at interviewing facilitators of men's programs, women's advocates and women's counsellors, and getting the data from them of what they're noticing from the men on group and from the men's partners on how men may be using program content, program processes in unexpected ways that can be quite dangerous.
Yeah, well, as you know, I've written a parenting program for men who use violence, and one of my concerns is that it will be used by men as an excuse to abuse their partners because their partners are not treating their children properly.
Exactly.
I think
exactly.
I think again it's one of those things where it's probably better to have one than not to have one, but there's a real risk.
Well, I think the women are at risk anyway. They're in risk at the moment. We obviously don't want to increase that risk, but we have to be obviously aware that whatever we do, whatever we don't do may have unintended consequences.
That's right.
The problem is when we're unaware of that. If we're aware of it, there can be some way of managing it and some way of being alerted to it and dealing and having information passed to us where we can deal with it. I think the problem is where we think the program or the intervention is the answer and we don't realise how clever and how cunning, that these perpetrators can be.
Yeah, because we were saying that both you and I have an academic background, but also we've probably both strongly been influenced by women. Certainly, most of my significant mentors through the years have been women.
Yeah. Well, I grew up. My dad died very early. I was only 8, so I grew up with mum and 5 sisters as the only boy. So I'm while it was difficult not having a dad. There was also something maybe very lovely about growing up with all women as a boy, and I don't want to romanticise a single mother's battles, but there's always silver linings, aren't there? But I would say I would not be doing this work if it wasn't for a number of very significant women in my life. Carol Smith was the first woman I facilitated groups with. I was in awe of Carol's work with men, and I learnt so much from her. It was like scales fell off my eyes. I started to see relationships, men and women, differently from doing this work, and started to realise that while I never saw myself as a violent man, there was some sense of privilege or entitlement about being a male that I was not critically reflective about at that stage in my life. Certainly Ellen Pence from the Duluth model, who died a couple of years ago. Ellen Pence, I did training with her in America in this group facilitation work and in the Duluth approach. She was very influential. Hugely hilarious woman, great soul, big-hearted woman, who worked very respectfully and beautifully with very violent men, and who really, I think, changed the landscape of domestic violence intervention. Her and Michael Paymar and that Duluth approach, and at home here in Queensland, people like Betty Taylor from the Red Rose Foundation. I've known
Betty's
Betty.
Been so influential.
So influential. I've known Betty since 2003 and worked with her over those years. And, without that, without those women leading the way, I wouldn't be following.
Yeah, I mean, my own experience was certainly, I grew up in a very conservative home and in a very conservative church as well, and so I had all of those against me, and I was always grateful that women would still patiently, very patiently, try and teach me and try and help me understand, and they never gave up, and I always appreciated that, and I think that's something that has had great, it encourages me when I'm working with men, because I want to show the same patience that I was shown and the same persistence. But there are a few women in particular. When I was a young person, there were two in the States, Zelma Green and Lois Brown, who had a great impact on me. And then later on, coming here, the first person I worked with was Dorothy Ginn from the Child Abuse Prevention Service in Sydney. She was a remarkable woman, one of the pioneers. And then more recently, my dear friend and colleague Dawn Baker, who I initially taught with at QUT. She was the one who really started me into feminism and into understanding that. But I'd also like to pay tribute to a few men who have played an enormous role in my life. And this includes people like Bob Pease, Ray Connell, whose writings have been so influential for so many of us. I'm just trying to think, Michael Flood. And then some people who probably aren't as well known into the field, Mark Kraywald, Cameron Boyd. There's a variety of people that I think have also really helped me a good deal.
We all stand on other shoulders, don't we?
We do, yeah. And hopefully there are a few people standing on our shoulders as well. Hopefully we're all connected and all part of the same pyramid. But
and you know, when you're a father of a daughter, and it sort of makes this work more personal in some ways, you know.
Yeah.
So you want things to be safe and respectful and life-giving for everybody. And this isn't, for me, this work isn't about putting men down or male bashing, as it's often portrayed, that the domestic violence sector is holding men back, and you know, it's not. It's about making it better for everybody. And if, as I said before, if we make it safer for women and children, we've made it safer world for men too.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to say, you know, my discovery of feminism was that it was actually freeing for me. That it allowed me to see aspects of my life that I never felt comfortable with. And probably some aspects of the male template I could never quite jam myself into. And I realized I didn't have to do that. And I thought that was, you know, and I know that's not the basic message of feminism. No. It's a side message, but it was still a liberating one.
You know, as they say, feminism is for everybody.
Yes, it is. Yeah. So it's... But we were talking earlier about the groups, and one of the questions one of the topics that you mentioned was about motivation and how you build a man's motivation. And I can imagine people watching this wondering, well, how do you build a man's motivation? So could we talk for a moment or two about that before moving on to some other...
Well, as I was saying, I think initially external motivation is the way to go. And by external motivation, I mean courts. I mean a strong police response. I mean probation and parole oversight. I mean the likelihood that a man will go to jail if he's not compliant. I think that has been shown through research to actually enhance the outcomes of a men's program. If you don't have that initially, if that's watered down, that's, as I said, sending a message that we as a community don't take domestic violence seriously.
Yes.
We as a community don't really care if you go to this program or not, because we're not going to follow it up if you don't go. And my problem, of course, is that for non-compliance, I believe in Queensland, we don't have a really strong response. And I think, again, the research would bear this out. The response, the consequences have to be threefold. They have to be certain. So it's not an option, it's not if or maybe. If I don't do this, there's going to be a certain consequence.
This is what will happen.
Yeah, this was what happened. This was what will happen. There has to be celerity. New word I've learnt, Ron, and I'm banding it about willy-nilly. Celerity means swiftness. So not only does the consequence have to be certain. It has to be a swift consequence. It's a bit like parenting in some ways.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
And thirdly, it has to be severe enough to be meaningful. So certainty, celerity, and severity. And by severe, I don't necessarily mean harsh, but it has to be something which shows we as a community or we as a program take compliance seriously. This upfront will upload upfront accountability. So you know transparently what the consequence will be for non-compliance. Now, sometimes I talk about this at a systems level, and sometimes I talk about this at a program level. I'll give you an example of the program level. We've had men who might not turn up for 3 sessions, and if they don't turn up for 3 sessions without valid, good excuses, we tell them that's non-compliance. You know, you signed up for the program, you agreed to let us know about a good reason for you. You know, we're not Nazis here by any stretch of the imagination. If you can't turn up because of sickness or life circumstances, let us know. We will be mark that as an absenteeism, and we will work with that. But if a man doesn't turn up, so we had a man who wanted to complete the program, he told us he missed 3 or 4 sessions and then wanted to rejoin the group. He was up to about week 12 of a 16-week program. So we could let him just come back and finish the 4 sessions. But what we said to him is, because you had done 12 sessions and you're reasonably close to the end, we think you should do an extra 4 sessions. So you end up doing not 16 sessions, but 20 sessions. And we had this discussion within the group. And the group said, well, that seems fair to us. What about you? Are you willing to? Yep, that seems fair. So this guy did 4 extra sessions that he normally wouldn't have had to do. So that was a consequence, and it was a meaningful consequence. By harshness, I don't mean we get the lash out or anything like that. It's not that. It's just that we take the program seriously. You can't, if you sign a contract to adhere to number of sessions, we expect you. It was called the Responsible Men's Program, to be responsible. You weren't responsible, therefore there has to be some sign that you're willing to work with us. On a system level, it may mean that a man stays on probation and parole longer. That a man might even be elevated to a high risk if he's showing non-compliance, because we know non-compliance is a potential for recidivism, that he might re-offend.
Yes.
So courts may impose some community service on him, as well as the completing the men's program. That if he doesn't complete the men's program, that's a breach of his conditions. If we don't take that seriously, the message to him is that I don't have to take it seriously. So, and again, that to me ties into what we were talking about having men mandated to programs and being, required to do this. So what's next is that working with the men respectfully, supportively, with accountability though, that they know we have a job to do and that we're accountable to the court, to police, and our primary accountability, and this is where it's different from counselling.
Yes.
Your client is in the room with you. Your primary client is in the room. Our primary client is the women and children of these men. That's who we're there to keep safe, primarily. And, obviously we want a man's motivation to move from violence to non-violence, from disrespect to respect, from coercion to to you know, relational
Yeah, and we
accountability.
genuinely believe his life will be better and happier if that happens.
Yeah, we want that to happen, of course. But if a man does not work with us, if a man resists that, if a man decides to stay violent and abusive, then that woman has to be kept safe, whatever happens on our program, one way or the other.
Yeah.
So, so in terms of motivation, we do what we can in the group. We have what we call critical conversations with these men about masculine, hyper-masculine beliefs, about the man box, about male scripts, about what it means to be a man, and how dangerous that is, not only for women and children, but dangerous for the man himself. We unpack. Men will come in and say, I've got an anger problem. We certainly break that down. You don't have an anger problem, you've got an abuse problem. Everyone gets angry at times. Anger is emotion, abuse is action. Big difference. So it's what you decide to do with whatever emotion you have that's the problem here, not the emotion itself, generally. So we talk about sexual respect. We talk about safe parenting. So a whole range of topics which are focused on becoming non-violent. And interestingly, I've found in my years in this work, while we might think we've got a great program in terms of content, curriculum, exercises, and that can be additive, that can be useful.
Yes.
The longer I stay in this work, the more I find it's breaking down an individual man's loneliness and isolation. In having him feel like he belongs to a group. Now, I know it's a violent men's group. It's not a men's support group.
Yeah.
But when a man can talk about stuff safely without being held to account but not being judged, there's a difference, I think. Then there's a certain I think it has the potential to re-socialise a man and to make a man feel like he's part of something bigger than himself. And obviously we want that part of something bigger than himself to be a non-violent male community. But a lot of these men, as I've said previously, have multiple disadvantages in their lives too. Not all, but they feel part of a group, and many are genuinely I've had a man say to me, what do I do now? What do I do now that I don't have this group anymore? So they build up some kind of connections. And we don't want them to be harmful connections. We want them to be connections that keep them on the right track. And I know men who have formed friendships through these groups where they try to hold each other to account. Not that I've followed them up years after to see if that's been a safe and respectful thing. But that would be some interesting research. I've seen destitute men on group be supported by men of means in a group, which is it's not the purpose of the group, but maybe in some ways there's the potential for positive unintended consequences too. I don't know, but I think there's something about getting these men in a group which far outweighs anything an individual counsellor can do with these men. I think if the consequences for serious domestic violence towards women and children is jail, so be it. That's important. You cause someone harm in our community.
Yeah.
You pay the price for
It would
that.
be very inconsistent if that wasn't the consequence.
Exactly. But now I think there's an opportunity while a man is in prison for domestic violence that we do him a disservice if we don't provide him the opportunity to have a resource in jail which he can use to work towards non-violence.
Yeah.
If he goes to jail and he leaves jail without any educative process, any ways of changing himself, he could actually potentially be more dangerous on release than prior to going in.
Yes.
Now, I know in Queensland we've had some trial sites. I think in 3 prisons in Queensland they've had men's programs. My belief is let's not do the trial sites, let's roll out programs in all prisons for men who have violence issues. And I would think they would be of enormous benefit to the community on a man being released. So that's all I'd like to say about men doing jail time for violence. But I'd be very keen to hear your next segue or final.
Well, I guess it's time for me to
details.
start wrapping things up, which is, I guess it would be very difficult to summarize what we've talked about today. But my reflection on it is, again, this is a field that we simply don't know enough about. I feel my field, which is psychology, began working with trauma as we understand it now in the late 19th century, and then spent most of the 20th century trying to deny that it ever occurred. And of course, in terms of things like gender oppression, things like that, well, we've never hardly looked at it at all. And as a result of that, we're left here at the beginning of the 21st century without the knowledge that should have accrued across what you could argue was probably the most traumatic century of human life so far. And I think that that's a shame. But I think we actually have to just acknowledge that. And that when you and I meet again, hopefully we will in the future, to talk about what we've learned over the next period of time. A lot of the stuff we're talking about now we'll at least see in a different light, even if we may not change some of our basic beliefs. I mean,
I agree, Ron. I agree that we need to know more about the work with men, but I also believe we know enough to know it's important. We know enough to know that we need to put more resources into it. We know enough that this is identified as the source of the problem, that if we don't work on this, we're not going to change the status quo for women and children down the track.
No, that's true.
And I think we know enough to realise that we also have to work on developing a sustainable workforce who can do this work into the future. Because sadly, you and I, unlike superheroes, won't be going on forever. And we need people to step up and do this work, don't we?
Despite the fact this conversation might indicate we could.
Yes, indeed. Indeed.
It's true.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Ron. Very provocative questions, fertile questions, I call them. And hopefully the interaction and the discussion have been useful for somebody somewhere.
Yes, and we thank you for bearing with us.